morning. Can you guys hear me fine? All right. So I just titled my presentation as Growth is Not Marketing. It's a bit controversial, but it's really true to how we thought about growth at Airbnb. Something that we deeply cared about was how to think about growth long-term and growth that's more sustainable. Also, partly because we didn't really have that much money at the very beginning. So it was something that we really had to do out of a need. But over the time, we kind of mastered that art. And what I'm going to talk about today is the journey and the key lessons that I've learned. And hopefully some takeaways for you guys to actually implement in your own, at your own startups. So first, let's start with a little introduction about myself, and then we'll go talk about some of the growth principles that have shaped the strategy of how we thought about growth at Airbnb, and then look at the journey on how we actually applied those. If you guys have any questions, I'll leave about 10 minutes at the end of the conversation. Feel free to put your hands up, and let's make this as interactive as we can. I mean, all of you guys are doing serious jobs. So I want to make sure we're not wasting time, and if something's a bit repetitive, just say, oh, all right, we're done. Okay? Let's get started. So my name is Mona. I started as the first female engineer at Airbnb back in 2011, a long, long time ago. When you're at a startup, 7 years is a long freaking time. I started when the team was less than 30 people. We were a total of 8 engineers, and each of us kind of worked on one vertical. So someone did all of search, someone did all of payments, and I was responsible for doing all of guest and host acquisition. It wasn't called growth back then. It was called guest and host acquisition. And that was the only reason I actually was responsible for that was because of my previous experience. So before Airbnb, I was at another company called Aperture. It was a contextual search engine. Got acquired by Google, became part of the Chrome team. I led analytics there. And so I had spent a lot of time thinking about data science, how to think about building the right kind of dashboards, visibility for the entire team, a very important aspect of how you think about growth, right? And the other aspect of what I looked after at Aperture was revenue and monetization in terms of leveraging that data to build a bunch of advertising products on top of it. So it kind of was a mix of data, user behavior, and marketing, which in hindsight is actually what growth is, right? And so that's basically how I became responsible for acquisition, which ultimately ended up being growth. So basically, all along my journey, I've been very fascinated about data. I'm trained as an engineer. I care a lot about building products that are driven by user insights and sort of have all along the way sort of built on that as my strength. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about what is growth. I think I just want to sort of set the context on how at Airbnb we thought about growth, and I think it's a little bit different than a lot of the other companies on how they even not just think about it, but actually approach it, how they build teams around it, how they think about it from a strategic standpoint, how does it align to the larger 10-year, 20-year vision. We're going to talk about some of the tactical stuff on how you guys can actually use that framework in your day-to-day life. And then I'll just walk you through the Airbnb story, and you'll see how each of these tactics actually applied year over year and how we kind of built on it. And then we'll leave about 10 minutes for Q&A, so we have enough time to interact and answer and address some questions. Sound good? All right. So what is growth? Most people, if you ask, what is growth? Someone's going to say acquisition, somebody's going to say marketing. A lot of people in India will say Facebook ads and Google ads and whatnot, right? But I think it's much larger than that. I think marketing is just a very, very small aspect of growth. I think if you just look back at the history of how the internet companies have evolved, you're going to see a trend on what increases your probability of being successful. So if you look at the 1990s, when technology was new, your leverage was technology. If you built good technology, like the Ciscos, the IBMs, and the Yahoos of the world, you have leverage in being a successful company because that's your differentiator. Come to 2000s, people not only cared about technology, but they cared about the user experience of how they actually use the product. So design sensibilities, how users interact, whether you can actually deliver the value proposition, things like that, right? And so if you had great tech with great product, that was your differentiator, and your probability of succeeding was much higher. That's become more mainstream now. And so what that means is most companies that are doing decently well have good tech and good product. So what is your differentiator is great distribution. So how do you get to your target audience is actually your differentiator. And so if you think about similar companies like let's say Ola and Uber, right? Similar kind of product offering, but how they actually got to the user and how they actually distributed their product is going to determine the success of one company to the other and who sort of wins that competition, right? So it's becoming increasingly important to make distribution your differentiator. And I think in a very simple nutshell manner, distribution is growth, right? And so Peter Thiel, who's one of the board advisors on Facebook, founder of PayPal, wrote this book 0 to 1, and he captures it really nicely on the value of distribution, right? He talks about how poor distribution and not poor product is the #1 reason of why companies fail today. Because building great tech is not difficult anymore. There's APIs, there's libraries, there's SDKs that you can just kind of build on top of. There's a lot of abstraction where you don't really have to know very deep technology to build a good tech product. Similarly, for design, there's a lot of different UI libraries available. You can sort of prototype fairly quickly without having to be a very, very technical designer. And so distribution is what gets people caught up in how do you actually get to your end user and how do you get people to try your product. So distribution, in my perspective, is growth. That's how we thought about that at Airbnb. We think about distribution in 3 big buckets. First is acquisition. When we think about acquisition, I think one of the most important things to think about, and at the very beginning of when you start to think about your startup, is identifying who your target audience is. More often than not, people think of that as a very broad category. You ask, majority of startups, let's talk about at educational tech companies, right? You'll ask them who's your target audience, they'll be like, oh, everyone who goes to college. If you have such a broad offering, what that means, your MVP also has to cater to such a broad audience. So understanding who your target audience is, identifying that is the #1 step in sort of acquisition. The more targeted it is, the better it is because it means you're going to sort of spend a little bit less money to get to them. You're going to be able to find the product market fit for the right audience you're going to go after. You're going to know whether they're going to pay for it or not pay for it, whether there is revenue monetization built into it, things like that. So that's super important. The second is once you identify who this target audience is, you also want to understand where you'd find them. So where do they live today? What do they do on a day-to-day basis in terms of their behavior on consuming information online, right? So if your target audience is 16 to 25 and you were advertising or doing a bunch of acquisition efforts on Facebook, it's probably not going to be as effective as doing it on Snapchat. It's probably not going to be as effective as doing it on Hike. But if your target audience was 45 to 60, obviously Snapchat's not going to be your channel, right? So understanding who your target audience is and then identifying what channels they spend most of their digital life on, I think is super critical. The third is, I think, and I'm going to caveat this with a big asterisk, which is, I think, do not confuse acquisition with marketing. I don't think the only channel of acquisition is marketing. But I think marketing and PR are both great seed channels for acquisition. What I mean by seed channels are things that you can sort of because money can buy you some of this stuff, you can try and test your product and get feedback really quickly. You don't have to wait for organic adoption. You don't have to wait for users to find you. You can actually get to them by paying. But the point is, you only do that to seed your product usage. If that's the only channel of acquisition you have, it's basically, you're fighting for, it's the race to the bottom, right? Because you're probably not going to have that much money to actually sustain this. Also with marketing, especially with digital marketing, it's a very interesting channel of acquisition because of three things. One is it's highly trackable, so you know who's using your product. So even if you started with, let's say, a target audience of 16 to 25, but when you started to do marketing and you realized that majority of your early adopters were actually 23 to 27, you can get a better understanding of what your value proposition is, right? Maybe you didn't fully understand what it was. Maybe you need to change the marketing message, whatever it is, right? Second is, I think, great part about digital marketing is also it's instant gratification. So you put an ad today, you're going to see some traction today. You're not going to have to wait for 5 days or 2 weeks or 10 days. The third is there's also good attribution technology that's built in today, which means that you know what channels are working for you and what channels are not. So it's a great way to understand when you have limited product and end resources, where to actually dedicate your time, because you'll know, hey, Facebook ads aren't doing that well. Let's not try to spend too much time in building all these things. Rather than that, let's spend time on building content because content's working better. Or within our product, we see a big drop-off between sign-up and the usage of the product, which means, hey, something is wrong in the product. So it's an easy, quick, instant gratification channel, but it's definitely something you should not overdo, because before you know it, if 80% or more of your initial users are driven through marketing, you may learn things that may not be true when they start to scale out. So that's an important thing to remember. And then I think this is the most understated acquisition thought that I think most people miss, and I think is one of the most unique things that we did at Airbnb that has sort of over the years compounded, is building compounding loops that, what I mean by compounding loops in simple language is, if you think about a parallel to finance, right? You have some principal, and then over a period of time, you make some investments that 5 years, 10 years give you compounding interest, right? You want to identify very early on what these compounding loops are in your product. What that means is, for example, for Airbnb, that was the referrals, right? So I spent $10 to buy this user through my marketing channel, but I built the referral loop in my product so that when this $10 user came to my product, he invited 5 other users that then invited 5 other users, and in no time, I was at about 500 users by just buying this one user at $10, right? But if I did not have that referral loop, I would basically be waiting for this $10 user to actually transact on my platform and to make it an ROI positive effort for me, right? So building these compounding loops very early on is an extremely important aspect of acquisition. And so the most basic question you should think about when thinking about acquisition is, how do I get more users through my front door, right? How do I get more users to try my product at least once? And hopefully you have confidence in your product where you know that if they try us once, they're going to come back, right? So try to get as many people as you can through the front door. The next and the most important thing is retention. I'm glad there is actually a conference just purely talking about that, because I think it's a very, very understated aspect of growth. Everyone obsesses about acquisition. Everyone obsesses about new users and obsesses about unique visitors and MAU and DAU and whatnot. I think retention, there's also a lot of common myths around retention. The most common one and the saddest one is when people talk about, hey, I'll think about retention after I think about growth. I don't think that is, I mean, if that's how you're approaching it, you're definitely not on the right path. Another one that people most commonly use is retention is not my problem, retention is growth team's problem. Which is also fairly sad because in the most simplest terms, retention is nothing but what is the value your product is providing, and there's an aha moment in your product, which is the differentiator of what you're trying to build, right? How fast can you deliver this aha moment to as many users as you can? And how often do you deliver this, right? It's basically retention. It's nothing else. It's basically how often is your product used, and is your product creating enough value for people to keep coming back again and again? And so I think it's something that the entire company should focus on, because imagine you don't think about retention and you spend all your dollars on acquisition. It's basically an equivalent of having a leaky bucket, right? You put a bunch of people at the top of the funnel. You don't have any hooks to actually retain them or engage them. What ends up happening is they come and they leave. And before you know it, if you just look at the chart of new users coming in, it's going up. You look at the chart of unique visitors, it's going up. But you look at the usage of your product, or you look at revenue, if revenue is built in already, it's just going to stay flat or churn or negative, worse, right? So retention is almost the most common silent killer for most startups. And so if you don't pay attention to it, you're going to be in big trouble fairly soon. You won't be in trouble as long as you have money in the bank, but the day you don't have money in the bank, you're going to be in trouble. So you'll see that pattern across lots of startups. So, and sort of, thinking about retention, again, I think the most critical aspect of retention is just identifying what the aha moment in your product is, right? So when does the user say, oh my God, this is why I should use this product? And once you identify that, the only thing you should really care about is how often can I deliver that aha moment and how fast can I deliver it, right? Does the user have to do 20 clicks to even get to aha moment? Does the user have to go through 50 flows to find that aha moment? Then it's really not aha because it's a lot of work. No one's going to do that. So that's basically in a gist retention. The next is monetization. Again, this is something that most startups, the common myth is, hey, I'll find users first and then I'll find how to make money, right? Only in exceptional cases that approach works. And by exceptional cases, I mean companies like Facebook, who are talking about 1 billion users, at companies like Twitter, where they have a shit ton of users and advertising is a supported model, right? It doesn't really work for majority of startups. And I think this is another big mistake people make, which is they don't necessarily think about monetization upfront. Part of it is because they don't actually know the value the product provides, or they aren't able to crystallize it. They think about, oh, it does a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but I don't think any user will pay for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build this deck with all the vanity metrics of very high unique visitors, very high new users, very high MAUs, and then I'll keep raising money till I know that I have found something that the users will pay for. I don't think that takes you very far. Also, another important aspect of monetization is, I think the liberty that it gives you is the level of experimentation you can do for acquisition. Because the minute you can monetize, you can understand where you want to spend your dollars for acquisition. You know which cohort of users are actually meaningful for you, which cohort of users are not meaningful for you, and you can kind of hyper-target that, right? So if there's just let's take an example of Flipkart, for example, right? Let's say users between 35 and 45 buying shoes are the most meaningful ROI positive cohort for me. I know that because I have a monetization which is buying that product. I can then spend all my acquisition effort on Facebook ads, on Google ads, whatever else there is. to just target that cohort. Because the rest of them are just coming to just hang around. They're not really shopping much. So why spend marketing dollars to do and sort of bring more of those people, right? So I think if you have monetization built in, or if you've thought about it, you may not be making money, but if you have at least given some thought about it, you can bake that into your acquisition, and then sort of over a long period of time, it becomes a bit more sustainable. So I'll just talk quickly about some of the growth tactics we use in each of these buckets at Airbnb, and I think this is very high level. I'm not going to get into too much detail because we have a lot to cover. But if you have any questions, write them down, hold on to it. We'll talk about it in the Q&A session. For acquisition, we looked at a few different things, and I will say we were fairly aggressive very early on because we had a very important and a difficult challenge, which is seeding the marketplace. I think marketplaces are some of the hardest businesses to build because obviously there's two sides to it, which is the supply and the demand side, and then also you have to balance it out because if you have too much supply but no demand, supply leaves. If you have too much demand but no supply, no one buys it. So, the marketplace cannot sustain itself. So it was a difficult problem. So we used a variety of different tactics. We definitely started with marketing because we wanted to understand what our product market fit was. So we started things like, we wanted to understand whether we should build more supply, which is just vacation homes. We should build more supply that is just, single homes, whatever, right? So basically, we did a bunch of marketing, but all of the marketing was, we didn't do any brand marketing. We only did performance marketing. We heavily leveraged the organic channels, which is Facebook and Google. Partly because I think we also were fairly early to the game of apartment rentals and alternate stays in hotel sections, so you could actually rank fairly well without doing much. We also leveraged PR, and as they say, no PR is bad PR. We had a bunch of bad PR and good PR, but we kind of capitalized on it fairly well. We did a bunch of creative stuff. I'll walk you through that in a little bit as we talk about the Airbnb growth story, but I think PR is an important channel. Fairly underestimated in the startup world. People wait to do any PR until they have a big round of funding or they have a big customer, but I don't think those are the only moments of when someone should leverage PR. I think PR can be leveraged in a variety of different ways. Another thing we did fairly early on, which is what I was talking about in terms of the compounding loops, is build in referrals and virality. So one aspect of referrals was, hey, you booked a listing, you had a good stay, you reviewed us as 5-star. Would you like to refer Airbnb to your friends? And if you did, they'll get a $25 coupon to try for their first stay, and you'll get $25 for inviting them. And so we sort of built that very early on. And what that did was every single initial user that came to the platform and had a good experience, they ended up inviting a lot of their friends because it was, obviously they had a good experience, but there was a monetary benefit to it. And at the end of the day, we started at less than 0.5% of our users coming from referrals. We were up to almost 10% of our users coming from referrals. So over a long period of time, that has a compounding effect on the network it can build. The second was virality. We did a lot of clever things around, sharing it on Facebook. Every single time you checked into Airbnb, you could, and you checked it on Facebook, it would show up with an Airbnb logo and a photo of the listing, which was one of the most stunning photos. And whenever you travel, everyone likes to brag about where they're living. So that was a great sort of social hack. The next one was partnerships. I think this is also something that's highly underrated. Very early on, we weren't really a brand. People didn't really trust Airbnb like the way they trust today. And so what we did was we actually partnered with a bunch of brands to build trust by association. So we did things like, for example, in India, very recently, we did a partnership with Jet Airways. We did a partnership with Apple for their back-to-school program. These are all brands that have inherent trust in the Indian user community, and so just by association, they're like, oh, if Apple's partnering with Airbnb, it must be a legit company. So trust by association is something that is also fairly underrated. And then the last but not the least is globalization. I think globalization is not every product has it built in. Airbnb did. And so in 2011, we went from being an English-only site to being available in 11 languages over a period of a month. And that sort of was a tipping point of how we built the global network. Retention, again, we just basically identified aha moment, and aha moment was how do you book a hotel in 3 steps. Another aha moment on the supply side was through a bunch of data analytics, we realized if we had 300 listings in a market, our market was ready to go. It would start tipping off. So early on, we did everything we could do to just get to that 300 number, and then we would start doing marketing, PR, SEO, a bunch of stuff around that. Customer support, I think people plan their travel for such a long time. They have so many dreams around it. And if even the slightest of the things isn't as expected, people get very upset. And so you want high quality customer support for that. And I think Airbnb probably has one of the best customer services. Third was payment systems. I think that's another area where people, if you don't have a smooth process, people, 1, lose interest, and 2, don't trust the ecosystem. Monetization, for us, it was built in. We had a 2-sided marketplace. We were taking a dip from both sides, so it kind of worked out for us. Airbnb growth story. I think I'm going to try to go through this. I think there's lots of inspiring sort of points along the journey, which I think may apply to a lot of folks. But I think it's also something that I hope inspires you to think a little bit deeper about thinking about retention and thinking about retention from a product perspective and not just throwing money at it. And I mean, Airbnb was started by 3 guys out of a bedroom, out of a pure need for wanting to pay rent. They just didn't have any. They were actually living together to start a company together. They wanted to build some idea, and they didn't really have money to pay for rent. So a weekend, there was a design conference, and Brian and Joe, who were living together, said, "Hey, we need money to pay rent this weekend. Let's just have some air beds, and let's make some money so that we can actually pay for rent." That was definitely not the idea they were going to want to work on for the long term. Turns out, within 20 minutes of them listing their place on Craigslist, they found 3 people wanting to stay with them. They each paid $80 a night, and that sort of covered for their rent. But they, more importantly, had a very magical experience that weekend. They hung out with the host. They made breakfast for them. The hosts have now become friends. One of the guests was Indian, and he even invited all the founders for his wedding. They're all still friends. And 2 weekends later, they were still reflecting on that experience, and they realized they were onto something. And so they thought, why don't we give this a try, since we're thinking about starting a company together? And so they basically spent a bunch of time thinking about, what is the optimal time to launch. And South by Southwest is typically in the US is a conference where a lot of focus, it's basically spring break for techies is how most people would describe it. But a lot of companies are launched at South by Southwest. Twitter was launched at South by Southwest the year before. And so the founders thought, all right, I think Airbnb, this is a good time to launch. And so they just built the site in 3 months. They got 12 people to list their properties. And they launched at South by Southwest. During that stay, they had about 2 bookings, one of which was Brian himself. And things didn't really go that well. Following that, they realized they were just not able to grow. They were very event-specific. When events came, people would list their properties. When events went away, there was no buzz around the company. What would they do? And so they basically started, this is the most creative aspect of it, is they built a cereal box called Obama O's and Cap McCain's, which is just repackaging cereal, and they sold it on the internet during the 2008 elections, which was an historic election for Obama. They sold $4 box of cereal for $40, and they made $30,000 to survive for the next 5 months. From there on, they got admitted to YC. And during YC, Paul Graham told them one thing, why don't you go to New York City, talk to each of your customers, and try to understand why they're using the product and what they don't like about it. So Brian and Joe went door to door, and they noticed the properties had no good photos, which was the reason why people weren't really booking it. They became professional photographers, and they hand photographed every single one of those listings. We had about 112. They went to 112 listings and photographed each one of them. And that was the starting point of how Airbnb took off. And then a month later, about a year later, year later is when I started, and 2 weeks after I started, we had the worst trust and safety incident. We had a woman's house vandalized, and it was just a nightmare. We basically were sitting in the office for 10 days. Nobody left. Everyone slept on airbeds, and we were cracking out feature after feature. And basically, one of the biggest things we launched out of nowhere, we took the risk on ourselves. We underwrote all the insurance, even though we didn't really have that much money in the bank. But we gave $50,000 worth of insurance to every single host. That instilled trust back in the ecosystem, and that's the risk we took at the time, which I think was one of the biggest game changers for how Airbnb grew as the years followed. That $50,000 insurance is now up to $1 million. So if you have a home on Airbnb, you're insured for $1 million. We had iPhone, we launched apps, our acquisition sort of continued to grow. We localized our site in 29 different languages. We support payment systems. And here we are today with 300 million guests, over 4.5 million listings globally. And I think this is just the start. We've launched trips, we've launched experiences. I think if there's a few key takeaways I can tell you about is understand the value your product creates for the user. It's better to have 100 users that love you rather than 10,000 that only use you because you gave them coupons or you incentivize them, whatnot. Trust in your product is the greatest retention hack. Invest in building trust in the product. Take the risk when you have to. When in doubt, rely on data. All experiments can start on some hypotheses that are driven by gut, but it definitely cannot be decided or concluded unless there's data that you look at. And I think the most important thing is to have a single source of truth of data that's accessible across the company. Your CEO cannot be looking at a different dashboard than your product team, than your analytics team, because then you're all talking different numbers. I think unicorns are built if you out-execute your competition and you do the right thing to support your community. Your community is your strength. Your community is why you exist. And so take the risk, be true to your ethos, and I think you'll grow no matter what happens. I think this is another important one. You build the ideal experience, and then you work backwards from it. What ends up happening is when you try to automate the system from very early on, you miss key insights on what is making the experience special, and then you sort of can't really scale that. So you kind of struggle with simple nuances that you've missed because you just haven't tried doing this even once manually. And then I think this is another important one. This is related more to team building. I think getting members on your team that align on the core values of your company is more important than the capability. You may have a rock star, but if he's a nerd or he's a jerk, the rest of the team's going to run away. It's not going to be valuable for you in the long run. Also, I think you have to really be really true to what your core values are. I think more often than not, you'll be in situations when you have contradictory choices to decide from, and unless you don't have those values, there's no way you can consistently make a choice that takes you further from a long-term strategy perspective. So yeah, in a gist, I think be true to the mission. I think growth follows. As you can see here, every year on New Year's Eve, our number has sort of almost doubled. We've done several things. We've sort of been honest when things haven't gone well for us. We know that we have the support of the community, and when the community needs us, for example, when there's disasters like the Mumbai rains, the host opened up Airbnb homes without charging $1. So the community helps each other out. We do a lot of the nonprofit stuff as well. So I think as long as you hold true to your mission, I think growth follows. I think that's my biggest takeaway, and I think if your product, if you obsess about every aspect of your product and delivering value to the end user, I don't think you should have any trouble initial years will be hard because you want to grow right, but at the same time, it'll be long-term growth. It won't be growth where you're trying to find the same users again and again. All right.
All right, thank you so much, Mona.
Yeah, you guys can find, I think we're running out of time, but you guys can find me on Twitter at Mona Gandhi. If you guys have any questions, just ping me, and then I'm around here too, so you can. All right, we'll take a couple of questions. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah, go.
We are a B2B2C product. So acquisition is kind of taken care of because enterprise takes care of it, and monetization is also taken care of. How do you take care of retention where we have an enterprise app and the companies, we are at the mercy of the company's end users to use it? How do we kind of build strategies towards it?
I mean, why is the company using you, right? If you understand why the company is using you and what value you provide as part of your product, if it's just the same as any other user, and if your differentiator is just the price, then you're sort of competing just on price, right? But if it's the value of the product you provide, I think that's your retention. Like I said, I think the biggest retention driver for any company is the product itself. And so understanding why your users are using it, you may have 20 features, but there's definitely just one or two which is driving the majority of usage. I think identifying that and doubling down on making sure that you consistently deliver at least those two product features, I think is how I would think about retention.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah.
When you're talking about building compounding loops, how do you identify, say, you have 5 ideas which could turn into, say, compounding loop at some point of time. How do you prioritize those? And second is, how do you convince the other stakeholders that, at some point we need to build this so that, that compounds? So
yeah, that's a great question. So I think 2 things. One is, and this is how we've done it year over year. I think one is you take advantages of 2 models. One is called the quantitative modeling and the other is called qualitative modeling, right? So let's take the case of referrals. A simple qualitative modeling in very plain English would say, hey, today we have 10,000 users. If 1% of that user base invited 10,000 other users, in turn, 1% of that invited 10,000 more, in a period of from now until 4 years from now or 5 years from now, what would that number of user look like? So that's one option we can pursue in terms of product and eng. The other is, what if we had content loops, right? Where we wrote content, Google would index it, people would find it, and then people would come back to us, right? If we did that, we would have to write 10,000 articles for X number of people to come back to us, which would then create more content, which then, the loop keeps on writing, right? And so if you project these out for a period of 5 years, each of the opportunities that you have, it's very easy to understand where you would actually spend a lot of time and effort. And I think once you have this quantitative modeling, it's also very easy for other people to align to it because they clearly see the path of how you're gonna get to one versus the other and what the benefit of one versus the other is, right? Sometimes you have to make choices that are not purely driven quantitatively, right? So, for example, some channels are long-term. For example, SEO, right? It's not like you build some content today and tomorrow you're going to be ranking #1. So you just have to invest in them for the longer term. So those are sort of, I think of those as hygiene, right? So you just have to do them because over a period of time, there's no escape. But other things where you have to spend, should you spend giving $25 to a user on referrals or should you spend $25 to acquire a user on Google Ads? If you build this quantitative model in projecting out 5 years, I think you should be able to talk to a lot of get a lot of alignment and also clarity in your own head whether you want to do this or not do this, right? The other aspect to the quantitative side of it is also understanding what the effort of building something like this is, right? And what the probability of success is. So combining these 3 things, so you have the projections, you have the resourcing, and then you have what is the probability of one succeeding versus the other, right? I think this is how we've made decisions. This is how we've experimented. We said, okay, referrals is big. We projected out saying, if we do these things right, we're going to be at 10% of our user base coming from referrals, which is by far the biggest acquisition channel, single acquisition channel. And for this, these are the efforts we need to make on product. We should prioritize it versus spending it on paid marketing, even though paid marketing is going to give us impact tomorrow, right? So I think if you do this modeling, you'll probably find the answer.
I think I'll just add one more point, Mona, to that, because it's a question that everybody else struggles with. My name is Avlesh, for those who don't know. So, other than all the aspects Mona highlighted, which is all data-driven, perfect. There is an organizational barrier always, right, for people to make those decisions of whether we should do this or not. Very, very tough, because most of the times you won't have enough data to take that decision. When that's the case, and I've seen a bunch of companies that I respect follow, is what Bezos highlights in his letter all the time, is let's agree to disagree, and I'll commit it anyway. Which is, you make decisions very quick. You build a framework in the company to decide very quickly, and you decide what matrix you want to track for this experiment to be successful. You decide all of that beforehand, and then you go all out. You do that. If the metrics are in line, you're doing great. If not, you course correct. That's essentially the framework a lot of great companies follow. There is no other way of doing it, especially when there are 20 smart people sitting in a room trying to come to a conclusion. It's not going to happen, right? That's on top of whatever Mona highlighted. That's a framework I've seen a lot of companies follow.
Yeah, and I think one other point is, I think your success, your probability of success in terms of focusing on growth is only as good as the level of commitment you have from the higher up part of the organization. Because if you're constantly just struggling to get alignment in terms of budgeting, in terms of resourcing from your CEO or your CTO, you're basically just spending cycles doing things that are unwarranted. I would say if that's the case, first step is actually sit down and have a conversation on whether this is even important to them or not. And if it is, then it should be a yearly process of like, all right, this is what we're going to do for the rest of the year. At least focus on growth, and this is the target, and then you figure out how we're going to get there, right? So there's lack of alignment, which I've seen time and again. I think there's one or two causes. One is the leadership doesn't really understand what the value of growth is. Or second is they don't have confidence in the team being able to execute it. If it's the latter, I think that's easier to fix. If it's the former, you really need to have that conversation before you spend too much time on the efforts, because it's not going to take you too far. All right, thanks, guys.
There's one last question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Mona. Manish here from Book My Show. In one of the key takeaway slide that you mentioned that there's no point in chasing a customer who comes to you purely because of an incentive, right? But how would you craft retention, or what is your take on a retention strategy for a customer who has not been an offer seeker, or who's not come to you, or you not purely acquired him via an incentive growth strategy, but you've organically acquired him, he's given you good business, he's been one of the tops of your customer bucket, but however, because of the entire game rotating around offers, the customer has gone to a competition. Would you see merit in chasing and getting him back again?
If he's been a customer that you have acquired organically, and hopefully he's used your product more than once, if that is the case, there is some aspect of your product that still appeals to him. I think you need to understand what that aspect of product is. Whether it's maybe the payments is simpler on your product, maybe finding the movie is easier, maybe he gets reviews better, he trusts the review system better. I don't know what it is, right? You identify what that aspect of product is. And I think if you can continue to communicate that product value over and over again to him in a variety of different channels. That can be marketing, that can be email, that can be content, app notification, whatever that is. There is value in bringing that customer back, right? Because he's found you organically, he's used you, he definitely values your product. There aren't that many people that do that, honestly. So at any given point in time, you'd probably have only 30, 35, 40% of a user base that's actually in that category, right? The majority is the other category. So you want to make sure you do as much as you can to sort of retain that customer base, because that's your most loyal customer base. He's not really looking for incentive, which also means that in most cases he's ROI positive customer for you. So you want to retain them. Thanks, guys.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mona. Mona, just a second. So I'll call upon Avlesh we just have a small token of appreciation for Mona for your time and all the insights that you shared. Thank you so much.